After stressing out over what to cover for my first video, I decided to start with something light, because I realized I'll have plenty of opportunities on this channel to dive into layered narratives, explore complex themes, and dissect the technical aspects of production in a serious way. For now, let's just talk about Maleficent. When the live-action remake was first announced, I cared for one reason: Princess Angelina Jolie. While early in her career, she may have been prized most for her so-called exotic look, also known as being a white woman with big lips, not to mention her Tomb Raiders, I think that over the years, audiences began to appreciate her more for her talent and the unique feel she brings to her roles. A touch of Helena Bonham Carter's edge, the youthful energy of Mila Jovovich, and the elegance of Gal Gadot, except she can act. So I was excited to hear that Jolie was cast as Maleficent, and when I saw her in full costume for the first time, I was actually giddy. She looked amazing, and I trusted that she'd deliver on the performance. It also made me curious to see a new spin on Sleeping Beauty with the villain at the helm, because Aurora is objectively the worst Disney princess. And I could make a video just on that, ranking the DPs, but Aurora's claim to fame is that she touched the only sharp part of a not sharp thing and fell into a coma. So even if you disagree that she's the worst, she's somewhere at the bottom. So the Maleficent film released back in 2014, and I won't pretend to remember it shot for shot, which is fine since this is mainly about the sequel. But I do remember the one constant throughout was Jolie's stellar performance, and that was enough for me to give the sequel a try, despite some reservations I'll get to later. If you don't know the story of Maleficent, I'll catch you up, and this is going to be long, but don't worry, chapters are your friend. The first Maleficent film sets up the world's primary conflict right out of the gate, with some good old-fashioned narrator exposition. Maleficent, who I'll call Mal going forward because I'm lazy and I like the Descendants, is a fairy who, for reasons yet to be revealed, is like 10 times bigger than every other fairy we see, and therefore obviously not one. The Moors has no hierarchy, but Mal is clearly the unspoken leader because she lives in a tree overlooking the land. She starts the day checking in on everyone, and at the first sign of trouble, she's the one they trust to handle it. In this case, the trouble is a poor human boy named Stefan who snuck into the Moors and stole a jewel, which he returns after Mal asks politely. Like Mal, Stefan is an orphan, but he tells her that he's going to live in the castle one day, because that's definitely not going to come into play later. And despite hitting it off, Mal tells him not to return to the Moors. But we all know little boys can't resist winged demons, so Stefan hints at coming back, and when they shake hands goodbye, Mal is burned by his ring. She explains that iron burns fairies, which is definitely not going to come to play later, so Stefan tears the ring from his finger and flings it across the field. Over the years, their friendship develops into something more, and on Mal's 16th birthday, Stefan gives her the gift of true love's kiss, which was beautifully shot, by the way, and definitely not going to come to play later. Then he disappears. So far, we know Mal is lonely and longing for familial affection because she makes a dancing couple out of twigs. We know she's caring because she looks after the creatures in the moors. We know she's peaceful and forgiving because she doesn't wreck Stefan's shit for stealing from them. And we know she's powerful because everyone looks up to her despite her being a child. As for Stefan, we know he's greedy at his own peril because he snuck into a forbidden place and stole from it. We know his integrity is iffy at best because he told Mal he wouldn't have given the jewel back if he'd known she was just going to throw it away. We know he's ambitious because despite being a dirty little nobody living in a barn, he's pretty confident he'll live in the castle, and we know he cares for Mal enough to throw away one of the few things he owns just because it brought her pain. So, when Stefan stops visiting Mal, she does what any lonely, caring person would do. She aches for him, concerned for his well-being, while we wonder what selfish crap this jerk who seemed to love her could possibly be up to that's keeping them apart. Turns out that while Mal was pining away and protecting the Moors from the king's increased hostilities, Stefan was worming his way into the king's good graces. As fate would have it, Mal mortally wounds the king in battle, and he promises that whoever kills her will be rewarded with his crown. Knowing Mal's weakness to iron, which didn't really matter since it was never established that she couldn't be injured by anything else, Stefan volunteers to do the deed. So he steals away into the moors one night like a creep, and despite having abandoned her for his ambitions, Mal accepts him back into her life like any peaceful, forgiving person would do. They share their lovey-doveys, and Stefan gives her a drink that knocks her out, planning to stab her with his dumb letter opener thingy, but he either doesn't have the heart or the stomach to do it. Instead, he takes her wings, which I guarantee would be more emotionally scarring than stabbing her. I mean, look at this thing. It's not for cutting, and who knows why he brought this garrote. I just imagine him sawing and burning away at her wings all night, heartbreak snot dribbling out of his nose. But he returns to the castle, tells the king Mal is dead, and the king makes Stefan his successor. Meanwhile, Mal wakes up in agony, realizing her wings are gone, and later finds out Stefan stole them to become king. And so began her descent into darkness. She makes a wicked throne, which I thought was a nice touch, having a let it go sort of moment where she fully embraces her power and officially takes her place as the queen of the Moors opposite the king of the humans. Time passes, Stefan marries, his wife gives birth to Aurora Borealis, and this to me is where the remake shines. In the original animated film Sleeping Beauty, Mal was an evil witch who cursed Aurora because she was miffed that she wasn't invited to the celebration of her birth. Now, I personally don't think that was made as clear as it could have been, considering she complained about it in a very passive-aggressive, almost sarcastic way. But in the Brothers Grimm tale Briar Rose, which Sleeping Beauty is based on, unless you count La Belle au Bois Dormant, which predates Briar Rose by over a century, they explicitly state that as she was not invited to the feast, she was very angry and scolded the king and queen very much and set to take out her revenge. So that's definitely why she did it. Mal cursed a child over FOMO. And understand, she wanted Aurora to die after pricking her finger on a spindle. It was a fairy godmother who tweaked the curse, so Aurora would fall asleep instead. Speaking of fairy godmothers, I adored them so much in Sleeping Beauty. They were cute and charming, while the ones in Maleficent were... But to the remake's credit, the fairies had much better names. They were originally called Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. So, plants, animals, and Christmas snow. In the remake, they're called Knotgrass, Flittle, and Thistlewit. And what can I say? I'm a sucker for whimsical names I struggle to pronounce. At any rate, as an adult, my gripe with Sleeping Beauty is that it didn't offer much depth to Mal's character. There was no inner conflict, she was just evil. And even the fairy godmother said as much.
Maleficent doesn't know anything about love, or kindness, or the joy of helping others.
In fact, I like to think one line spoken off screen is what prompted the remake.
You know, sometimes I don't think she's really very happy.
While we're on the classic, I want to mention two things I completely forgot until now, even though they aren't at all relevant to this video. The fact that Prince Philip, who was like 8 at the time, was arranged to marry Aurora. At least Jacob had the imprinting excuse. This kid was just promised to a baby. And when Aurora pricked her finger, the fairies put the entire kingdom to sleep because they couldn't bear to tell Stefan that the princess got, which either raises the stakes or lowers them depending on how you look at it. Either way, it reminds me of Beauty and the Beast, since a lot of people ended up suffering because of one person. Imagine your friend gets knocked out by dark magic, and a fairy says, let's just fuck everyone's day. I'm sure they don't want to go on without her. And you're like, no, I'm fine. I'll have other friends. And she just zaps you into oblivion. But like I said, in the classic, Mal was very one note. Evil for evil's sake. In the remake, however, Mal's motivations are personal and raw. She doesn't curse Aurora because she got snubbed by royalty, even though she jokes about it too. She does it to take revenge on the only man she ever loved, the only human she ever trusted, who was so selfish and hungry for power that he mutilated her body and disabled her ability to fly, all so he could live a cushy little life ruling over a kingdom. A life he arguably could have had with Mal. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd say her anger was justified. Yet, unlike the original, she doesn't curse Aurora to die. She curses her to fall into a death-like sleep, or in her words, a sleep like death she'll never wake from, which is redundant because death is already like sleep you never wake from, but fine. Stefan begs her to stop, and Mal says, look, I like it when you beg, so here's what I'll do. Aurora can be woken from the sleep by true love's kiss. Who needs clapbacks when you've got callbacks? Of course, Stefan has all of these spindles in the kingdom destroyed and sends Aurora into hiding with the fairy godmothers until after her 16th birthday. In the original, Mal doesn't know where Aurora is hiding, so she spends those 16 years looking for her like a psycho. While in the remake, Mal knows where she is, so she spies on her. At first, it's out of morbid curiosity, but over time, she starts to care for Aurora, whose name I'm getting tired of saying, protecting her from the shadows. And when they finally meet, they form a mother-daughter bond so strong that Mal tries to remove the curse, and can't. Now, I have to say that all of this is played to perfection by Jolie. Her performance was so affecting that I'd recommend watching Maleficent for her character arc alone. The rest of it can be summed up quickly. Aurora isn't aware of the curse, so when she finds out, she's terrified of Mal and runs back to the castle like an idiot, where she of course finds her way to a spindle and pricks her finger. Now, I glossed over this part, but Aurora struck up a romance with Prince Philip at some point, so knowing she's about to catch her magic Zeds, Mal kidnaps Philip and breaks into the castle with him, hoping his kiss will wake her. And not that it bothered me, but Disney made Philip kissing Aurora a bit creepier here than it was in Sleeping Beauty, because in that film, Philip knew all about the curse and went to the castle specifically to break it. In Maleficent, no one tells Philip his kiss will wake Aurora. They don't even tell him about the curse. Mal just finds him in the woods, puts him to sleep, brings him to Aurora's bedroom, and wakes him up. So he doesn't even know where he is or how he got there. So the godmothers let him into the room, and when he sees Aurora, he asks them why she's sleeping, which is an odd question because it's not like people don't sleep. He should have said something like, "Why does she not stir from the commotion?" But fine. So the fairies say, "Well, she's enchanted. Anyway, she's beautiful, right? Don't you want to kiss that?" And credit where credit's due, Philip says, "Yeah, but that would be weird. I barely know her." But the fairies aren't having any of it. They just keep telling him to do it. He even wants to know more about the enchantment, but do they explain it? No, they just scream at him some more, so he finally does it. Obviously, the fairies pressuring him was played for laughs, and to be fair, it was nowhere near as disturbing as one of the earliest takes on the story called Sun, Moon, and Talia, where a king does a lot more than kiss Sleeping Beauty, and she gives birth to twins as a result. Moving on, Philip's kiss doesn't work and Mal is gutted. So she says some lovely words, kisses Aurora goodbye, and surprise, Aurora awakes. 'Twas Mal's love that was true. It's frozen all over again. Then the film ties up loose ends. Stefan tries to capture Mal, she turns her pet raven into a dragon instead of turning into a dragon herself like she did in the classic, which annoyed me at first, but I was fine with it after the sequel. I'll explain why when we get to it. Also, this shot of Philip fighting the dragon like a maniac, fantastic. Then Stefan gets the upper hand, and all seems lost, but sensing Mal's presence, her wings, which Stefan kept locked in a display case all those years, break out with Aurora's help and reattach to Mal, because sure. She and Stefan fight, he falls to his death, Mal stops being emo, she makes Aurora queen of the Moors, everyone is happy, Philip's there too, and the film ends with Mal soaring into a breathtaking sun-drenched sky. Overall, I thought it was a wonderful film full of fancy and beauty, and is one of my favorite performances from Angelina to date. If you've never seen it, it's absolutely worth watching despite the recap I just gave. But that's not why we're here, streamers. We're here to review the sequel, so let's. Released in 2019 with a beefier runtime than its predecessor, Maleficent, Mistress of Evil really was something, but I needed to watch it again to better communicate what that something was. I mentioned what feels like 10 years ago that I had some reservations going into it. I didn't feel like Maleficent needed a sequel, and when the trailer showed another of her kind, I worried it would get into some convoluted lore that detracted from her character, or worse, a love story that rehashed her baggage with Stefan. Thankfully, neither was the case. They managed to take the best elements of what could have been the worst things and use them sparingly to tell an entirely new story that felt like a natural progression from the first. I genuinely thought it was a good movie, but there were a lot of flaws I couldn't ignore, and I can't say the same about Maleficent, so maybe that was the better film. Or maybe it was inevitable that the sequel would have more bones to pick given the expanded runtime, story, and world. Regardless, Mistress of Evil picks up 5 years after the events in Maleficent, with a new kingdom called Ulstead, where Prince Philip is from, and we're immediately thrown into action and intrigue. Ulstead is separated from the Moors by a river, and we see 3 men crossing under the cover of night. They sneak into the Moors to kidnap fairies, and they manage to get their hands on an adorable little mushroom that looks like a newsie. But before they can escape, 2 of them are attacked by a horned creature. The 3rd man stumbles across a field of luminous plants called tomb blooms, which we later find out carry the essence of the fairies' dead, so the field is essentially a graveyard. He takes one of the tomb blooms, which I'm already tired of saying, and returns to Ulstead where he sells the shroomsy and the tomb bloom to someone in the castle called Lickspittle. Now, I know I praised the fairy names in the first film, but a name doing the ickiest verb to the nastiest noun is a bridge too far. Why not call him something nice like sip tea, slide whistle, or drive car? But vomit aside, I love this setup because it gave us so much information in the first 5 minutes without explaining it all through dialogue. We know these men are up to no good because they're traveling into the moors at night, and they're trying to be quick but quiet. One of the men says they should turn back, but another says they'll lose good money, so someone is paying them to do this. And when they arrive at a tree full of fairies, they say, "Here we are," as if someone who knows the area directed them to it, suggesting a traitor in the fairies' midst. So when the poacher gives the fairy to Lickspittle, he calls it a fine specimen, telling us it's going to be used for experimentation. And Lickspittle's reaction to the Toon Bloom tells us something about it is special, maybe even integral to his work. And the fact that he's in the castle tells us that someone working for the royals, if not the royals themselves, is behind all of this. What we don't know yet is why. Now, the one thing I didn't like about the opening was them showing enough of the creature attacking the men for us to know it wasn't Mal. If they only showed its horns, that wouldn't be clear, which would have strengthened the story in 2 ways. The first is that we would have learned there are others like Mal at the same time she did, rather than all the way at the beginning, and placing us in her shoes is more impactful than waiting for her to catch up. Because generally speaking, the longer it takes for a main character to discover what the viewer already knows, the more it can kill the pacing or tension. Not saying it did that here, just that it would have hit harder if we didn't know. The second is that when we later find out the poachers are dead, and Mal is kind of accused of having done it, it would have introduced an extra layer of conflict because we wouldn't know in that moment if she did. And given the harmonious way things left off in the first film, Mal escalating from slapping people around with her wings to outright murdering them would raise a lot of questions we'd want answered. But the filmmakers gave it away. It's like a see-through skirt, you know? Leaves nothing to the imagination. Anyway, after that downer opening, we cut to a beautiful day in the moors, and I could have done without the quaint narration this time, but fine. Aurora has settled in nicely as queen of the Moorfolk, and she and Philip talk about bringing their kingdoms together before he proposes and she says yes. There's nothing interesting about this scene except that Aurora's choker is painted on, and I don't know what that's about, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and I found myself staring at her neck for the rest of the film. So, witnessing the proposal, Devil Deg, or whatever the raven's name is, tries to tell Mal that Aurora is getting married, but Mal is back to her old grumpy self. At first I wondered why, but the narrator said that after what happened 5 years ago, the truth was lost, and the story spread that Mal cursed a child, killed a bunch of people, etc., etc., conveniently omitting her redemption and the fact that she was the one who lifted the curse. So she's back to being hated by the humans, and I guess that would make me cranky too. Meanwhile, back at the castle, we meet Percival, Ulstead's general and friendly neighborhood bigot who despises the Moorfolk and enjoys talking shit about them right to the prince's face. Philip tells Percival to ease up on the hate, but Percival makes it clear that he doesn't trust the Moors, and he's going to do whatever it takes to protect the kingdom without hesitation. So we have our first human antagonist, and we know he and Philip will come to blows before all is said and done, because he mentioned them being, friends, in the same breath as threatening to do whatever it takes when the moment arises. Also, this guy running in and out of frame with weed on his back made me laugh. Up next, we meet Gerda, the most obnoxious-looking character I've seen in a long time. No offense to the actress playing her, she's a lovely girl, but there wasn't a single second Gerda was on screen that I didn't want to pummel her face with a baguette. It's a combination of her stupid hair, her uptight nutcracker-looking outfits, and her dumb stoic face. But my real problem with her character is that she does the queen's bidding so intently and is a focal point so often, yet we're never given a hint at her motivations. There's one scene in particular, a word I can never say correctly in my American accent, that makes me wonder if I'm missing something or the film is. Was there a deleted scene that explained what the hell is going on with Gerda? It won't change the film because deleted scenes don't count as part of the narrative, but it would make me feel better. Back to the story, we then meet Philip's parents, King John and Queen Ingrid, played by my favorite Catwoman, Michelle Pfeiffer. And this scene is weird. It starts with Gerda telling the king their spoils arrived from an annexation, and it's a chest full of weapons. Then it cuts to this bizarre shot of a painter fake dabbing on a canvas with just so many folds in it, a sexy eagle on the right, and beyond the painter, the king is sat there motionless, staring off into the distance. Excuse me while I put on my pedant hat. If the king is posing for the portrait, why is the painter so far away and facing the opposite direction? Does he paint all of his subjects by peeking cheekily at them over his shoulder? And why would the king be posed with his head forward and sword up if the painting depicts him with his head and javelin down? Isn't the whole point of having someone pose for you to use their positioning as a reference? But that's not the weird part, friends. The weird part is how long it takes the king to respond to Gerda. She says they've got weapons, and 2 full seconds pass before he says, "No, we have no need of weapons."
Your Majesty, spoils from the annexation of the Midlands have arrived. Weapons.
No, we have no need of arms.
And not to harp on it, but you can see in this next shot what I mean about the painter. He's practically off in his own corner, and you can clearly see a horse behind the canvas that resembles the one on it. Is he painting that? Because that would make sense since he's facing it, but then what is the king posing for? You know what? It doesn't matter. The scene moves on to Queen Ingrid, who I'm going to call Pfeiffer instead because it doesn't make me sound like Daffy Duck. John says something about having her placed behind him. I assume he means in the painting that's already done. And she says that's where she'll always be while fawning over a table of weapons. So we have another antagonist, a queen who clearly resents being second to the king and having to defer to him and plans to kill him by stabbing him in the back. You know, because she'll always be behind him. Anyway, she picks up a crossbow and aims it around the room like a lunatic. Gerda points out that it's cocked, and Pfeiffer gives no fucks, but her sociopathy is interrupted when Philip enters the chat. She tosses the crossbow to Gerda, which triggers it to fire at the sexy bird, and we'll just ignore the fact that she tossed it as if Gerda were standing right in front of her, even though Gerda was all the way across the fucking room. So Philip struts in and tells his parents that Aurora said yes. John is thrilled, but Pfeiffer looks like she just lost 10 years of sleep. But she pretends to be okay with it and tells Philip to invite Aurora to dinner to celebrate, under the one condition that she brings Mal, which doesn't seem suspicious at all. And Philip thinks it's not the best idea either, but Pfeiffer puts her foot down, so it's settled. Now, I know Philip is supposed to look worried in this shot, but he looks like he's the one planning to kill the king. Look at that criminal double take. Meanwhile, back at the moors, Aurora drops the bomb on Mal that she's going to marry Philip, and Mal responds with her pitch-perfect charm.
No.
Of course, we know Mal doesn't hate Philip. She's just concerned about him breaking Aurora's heart, given how her love affair with a human turned out. Then there's a scene further establishing that the king wants peace, and he tells Philip to wear a sword to know he'll never have to use it, which means he's definitely going to have to use it, or at least be presented with the choice. Why? Time for a lesson break. You'll often hear irritating film students, screenwriters, and self-proclaimed movie critics mention Chekhov's gun because using industry lingo makes people feel like experts, but they don't always explain what it means. Contrary to how it's described, it isn't a rule that says if an object appears on screen, that object must be used. It's the broader principle that everything you include in your story should serve a purpose, as opposed to setting things up that have no payoff. It isn't a film thing, it's just an approach to narratives in general, and it applies to everything, be it dialogue, characters, locations, and beyond. The point is that a good storyteller should endeavor to have as little filler as possible to keep things tight. And when you call the reader or viewer's attention to something, it needs to be meaningful or brought to its logical conclusion. And the reason this emphasis on the purposefulness of details is called Chekhov's gun is because a writer named Anton Chekhov used the example that if you show a pistol on the wall in the first act, it needs to go off in the next. Otherwise, don't put it there. So while the sword being given to Philip could just be a meaningless gift, most stories adhere to Chekhov's principles to some degree, making it much more likely that this sword they're spending an entire scene on is going to be relevant later, and the king's foreshadowy dialogue all but confirms it. Class dismissed, back to the plot. After eavesdropping on Philip's conversation, Pfeiffer sneaks off to a secret passage, and I like that the entrance is in her wardrobe because it's the kind of place the king would never step foot in. I always think it's so dumb when the entrance to a secret passage is in a hallway everyone walks down or a library everyone sits in. I also like that she opens the passage by turning the dress form's head like she's snapping its neck. It's a sign of her deadliness, and since those are her gowns, it's like she's snapping her own neck or sealing her own fate. Anyway, which you'll notice I say a lot because I just do, beyond the passage there's a massive room full of ironworkers, and unlike the entrance, I can't imagine the king wouldn't find out about all of this shenanigans. I think it'd be less of a stretch if the king were portrayed as uninvolved and apathetic to the goings-on around him, but all we've seen is him showing an active concern for the kingdom and attention to what's happening in his presence. Even in the scene with the crossbow, when Pfeiffer picked it up, the king was adamant and said, "I told you we don't need arms." So his temperament explains why Pfeiffer hides the fact that people are toiling away tirelessly beneath their feet preparing for war, but it also makes it less believable that he wouldn't notice. That said, this is the kind of thing I only mention for the sake of a review. It doesn't actually bother me or test my suspension of disbelief. The excuse could be that all the guards are on Pfeiffer's side, so they lie whenever the king asks them a question. Like, why are there so many frickin' blacksmiths going in and out of the castle at all hours? By the way, this is the scene I was talking about earlier that made me wonder what's going on with Gerda. I know it establishes that she's the queen's right hand, but she's just so intense about it, and there's never an explanation why. Tell me the Moor folk killed her family and Pfeiffer took her in. Tell me she's secretly Pfeiffer's daughter from another marriage. Tell me anything other than nothing if she's going to get this kind of screen time and be this attached to the queen. Now we get to see Lickspittle's lab and the triumphant return of Shroomsy, reporting the news of his cuteness from inside a jar. This fairy is suspended in liquid, but this scene is funny to me because they try to make it look like whatever Lickspittle is doing is this grueling, meticulous process when it's clearly not. Now, up to this point, I've nitpicked some things my writer brain noticed because I felt they were worth bringing up, even though they aren't the sort of things I give much weight to when judging a film. This, however, is the first thing I cannot stand, because it's integral to the plot, yet makes no fucking sense. Pfeiffer has a spinning wheel.
Excuse me?
Is Pfeiffer a witch? Because unless she's a witch, she has no magic, and neither does that wheel. The first movie established that the curse resided in Aurora's body, not in a specific spinning wheel. That's why they had to destroy all of them. And when she found the room full of destroyed wheels, the curse inside her that led her there rebuilt one of them so she could prick her finger on its spindle. The second that happened, the deed was done and its power was gone. We even saw the light on the spindle go out. Now, you could instead interpret that light as a magical glint, proving the spindle has magic now, but Mal still broke the curse by kissing Aurora after that. So, even if I grant this film the impossibility that the curse for some reason remained in the spindle, how would Pfeiffer have gotten it? Remember, all of that took place in Stefan's kingdom, so the spindle Aurora touched should still be in his castle. And what are the odds it would still be intact? You think after they found Aurora's body lying on the floor next to it, that they didn't immediately toss that shit in a fire or break it down again? Now, listen, I know some of you might be thinking, why am I dissecting this so much? It's a silly Disney film, for Christ's sake. And the answer is, because I want to. This is a detailed review, and in my detailed reviews, I'm very detailed. Continuing with the details, I assume Stefan's castle was abandoned, but Aurora mentions in a scene we haven't gotten to yet that it was given to the people, which I thought was a nice touch, them bringing it up at all, because it reinforced the world's historical continuity. But even if I grant the film another stretch that the spinning wheel was intact and someone from Stefan's kingdom found it in the castle and brought it to Ulstead, why would the spindle work on the king? Did Aurora's blood turn into sleepy time juice that transferred to the spindle so it could infect anyone who touched it? My point is that if I have to ask this many questions and grant this much leeway to make something make sense, it's poorly written. They could have explained it with a scene where a cloaked figure approaches the castle with hidden cargo in tow, the guard waves them in, and as the carriage pulls away, the blanket covering the cargo slides off, and ta-da! It's a spinning wheel. At least then we'd know how it got there, and when Pfeiffer opened the door to reveal it, we'd also know she was the cloaked figure, because she already spends half the runtime skulking around in a cloak, and she's the only one in the film who mentions Stefan's castle, so it'd be reasonable to assume she knows about the spindle. Anyway, we see the wheel, Pfeiffer's all, "My plan is coming together," and it cuts to a fun scene of Mal practicing her greetings for the dinner. Then Aurora acts like an ungrateful snot by asking Mal to wear a scarf over her horns to make the royals feel more comfortable, which hurts Mal's feelings. Way to go, Aurora Astralis! Dinner time! Aurora, Mal, and Dieval arrive at the castle, and this scene is weird because it shows all of them being escorted down the hall, then Aurora enters the chamber alone and there's no one behind her. Where did they go? And since we talked about Chekhov's gun, here's a perfect example of what not to do. When Pfeiffer hugs Aurora, she sneezes and makes a big deal out of being allergic to the flowers in her hair. This comes up again later, only twice. Once during the dinner scene when Aurora tells Pfeiffer that Mal has an aversion to iron just like you have an aversion to flowers. And again at the end of the film during a scene that's supposed to be funny where Pfeiffer is sneezing while being tossed around in flowers. Neither of those things enhanced the story enough for her allergy to be called attention to in the way that it was. A much better use would have been if someone attacked Aurora and no one saw them do it, but a servant said they heard the assailant sneezing. Then it would tie back to the queen, making that allergy reveal matter. Instead, we got a scene that was just distracting. And if her reaction to the flowers was meant to serve as a metaphor for her relationship with the Moors, I genuinely don't care. So that scene was bland, but thankfully the dinner was spicy. Pfeiffer antagonizes Mal by stating that once Aurora marries Philip, she's going to live with them, not with Mal and the Moors. That's also when Pfeiffer mentions King Stefan's castle. Aurora tells Pfeiffer that Stefan's castle was never really hers. Neck check, there's no choker painted on this time, but there are a lot of wrinkles where the choker would be. Anyway, Pfeiffer keeps pressing, asking if Stefan died or was killed, to which Mal responds, both. Pfeiffer then recounts hearing a tale about an innocent child that was cursed, which the king somehow never heard before, despite the fact that it was established in the opening narration that the humans are afraid of Mal because of that story. Now the gloves are off, and we get into the good stuff. Mal says, you know what? Fairies are being stolen from the Moors by humans, and someone gave the order. Why don't we talk about that, bitch? And Pfeiffer's like, are you accusing us of something, bitch? And Philip's all, tag mom, chill, bitch. So Percival mentions that they found two peasants dead outside the Moors, and Pfeiffer's like, humans are being slaughtered in the Moors, and you're talking about missing fairies? Who gives a shit about them? It all escalates beautifully until the Queen's cat attacks Dieval, and Mal uses her magic to freeze it, telling the royals to contain your animal, or I will. Cue my favorite exchange in the entire film.
If I didn't know better, I'd say you were making a threat.
Well, do you?
Do I what?
Know better.
Surprisingly, Aurora and the king manage to temporarily defuse the situation, and dinner continues cordial as cherries until Pfeiffer says Mal did a good job raising Aurora and all, but she'll take it from here because as of tonight, she considers Aurora her own. So, Mal has a bit of a tantrum. She calls off the wedding, the guards try to subdue her, and Pfeiffer takes the opportunity to run behind the king and give him the old pokerino. We don't see it happen, I just know it did because of the foreshadowing, but I didn't like the execution. Pfeiffer stabs him, and at the time I didn't know what with, but he says, what has she done to me, before collapsing, and that didn't make any sense. If Pfeiffer stabbed him with a knife, a stab he clearly felt because he said, he wouldn't say, what has she done to me? He'd say, what have you done? Because I've never been stabbed, mind you, but I imagine if someone shanks you in the back, you're not going to think that pain came from someone across the room. But it turns out Pfeiffer stabbed him with the spindle, which makes even less sense because when Aurora touched the spindle, she went down like a power line in a blizzard. So why would the same magic affect the king more slowly, like poison, where he had time to say, what has she done, and fall all over the place before finally going to sleep? Also, where was Pfeiffer hiding the spindle? It wasn't in her hand when she ran to the king or after he fell, and I know damn well that dress doesn't have pockets. I'll answer that question for me. It was literally up her sleeve. So I thought it was an ineffective misdirect, though I did enjoy the fact that Mal couldn't care less it was happening. She was like, anyway, let's go home, beastie. And I'm a bit torn on what happens next, though, because I hate when a plot is propelled by someone not finishing a sentence or failing to clear up a misunderstanding. Pfeiffer accuses Mal of cursing the king, and considering that Mal just flipped out and knocked a bunch of people around the room, Aurora understandably asks Mal what she's done. Mal says clear as crystal that she's done nothing, so Aurora should trust her just like Mal trusted Aurora enough to go to the castle. Instead, Aurora runs to the king's side and asks Mal to wake him, confirming that she doesn't believe Mal and is siding with the humans. So Mal flies away, angry and hurt. Now, I get that they needed to inch Aurora towards an inner conflict between her human side and her life with the Moor folk, but I would have liked that scene more if Mal kept trying to convince Aurora that she didn't do anything, throwing suspicion back at Pfeiffer, with Aurora sticking up for the queen and that being what broke Mal's back. Nevertheless, as she's flying away, loyal Gerda uses a crossbow to shoot Mal down with an iron pellet. Mal falls out of the sky and her magic weakens, which we know because her staff turns into a stick, and Dieval, who's flying with her, flips back and forth between human and bird before settling as human. He lands somewhere on the castle grounds while Mal lands in the river, and Gerda watches her motionless body go over the falls. One thing I didn't mention yet is how visually dark this film is compared to the first one. Anything that happened at night was barely visible to me, which you may not notice because I'm going to brighten any footage I use, but boy, did it strain my eyes. So, the film cuts to the king's bedroom where Pfeiffer is playing the grieving wife and insisting that a curse on the king is a curse on the kingdom. Aurora feels like she's to blame, but Pfeiffer says she's not. Mal is just a threat to everyone, especially to Aurora, so they'll protect her. The only memorable part of that scene was the moment when Philip and Aurora suggested that Pfeiffer try kissing the king, since True Love's kiss broke Mal's curse before. The fact that Pfeiffer protests at all should have been a red flag to everyone in that room. But she finally caves and does it, and when the kiss doesn't work, Aurora leaves for the moors to look for Mal. Meanwhile, it cuts back to Gerda, who's still hanging out at the telescope, and we get one of my favorite shots in the film. Something in the distance bursts through the clouds with such force that they funnel around it. We hear the sound of its wings first, even though that doesn't make sense because it's framed from Gerda's perspective and she's miles away, but I'll allow it because it was effective and I never drive without my poetic license. So we see underwater that it's another of Mal's kind, and I feel like they lingered on that scene way too long. After he dove in and we had the shot of him floating opposite Mal, I wish it had cut to the close-up of her eyes opening and her POV catching a blurry glimpse of his silhouette before cutting to him breaking through the surface with her body and returning to the clouds. It would have read a lot more powerfully than showing him swimming up to her and doing the hand thing over her face like John Travolta in Face Off. Doubly so if it was the first time we saw another Mal, which I already talked about, but we already know there's another one, so the scene is just cool. Back to Aurora, she reaches the moors on horseback, despite the fact that Olstead and the moors are completely separated by the river. Again, there's no bridge. That's why the poachers had to use makeshift boats, and why Mal had to create a bridge of her own using roots. That was for Aurora's sake, obviously, because Mal and Dieval can fly, but the bridge retracted as soon as they stepped off it, and Mal is gone now. So what did Aurora do? Ride to the river's edge and shout across to the moors to make her another one? I've never seen a single root do anything without Mal's magic directing it to, but fine. Aurora arrives in the moors on a plot horse, and Mal is nowhere to be found, but Dieval is there and confirms that no one's seen her. He's worried that he'll be stuck as a human, Aurora's worried the king's curse won't be broken, and we get this really awkward shot of them looking up at something. When the camera finally cuts to it, it's the tree Mal sleeps in, but it's so far away that it took me a minute to even notice it. I thought they were just looking at two big mountains for some reason. It just felt so unnecessary. Like the next scene, where Mal's being carried over the ocean, and she's looking at the creature's hair, and she has flashbacks of baby Aurora. Listen, show don't tell is generally true, but there is such a thing as too much show. They should have just cut to the wide shot of them approaching the island and nothing else. Anyway, back at the castle, Gerda and Pfeiffer are meeting in secret. Pfeiffer asks if Mal is dead, and Gerda's reply is a testament to why I want to slap her face.
The iron pierced her flesh. She fell into the river and went over the falls.
The correct answer is I don't know, bitch. I hit her and she went down, but something rescued her from the water. But no, please, draw it out some more.
There was something else. Another creature. It pulled her from the depths of the sea.
What did it look like, Gerda?
Her.
So Pfeiffer realizes it's time to kick things up a notch, and we get another montage of weapons being forged that we didn't need because the shot of the guards fortifying the castle and creating a perimeter at the river was enough to convey an escalation. We also already had a smithing montage at the start of the film, so nothing was progressed by having another one. But fine. I think we're about an hour into the film at this point, with another left to go, and is where the next chapter of Mal's life begins. So why don't you take this moment to grab a snack and like the video? Meanwhile, I'll take a moment to drink my seltzer, and to say that if my audio ever sounds strange, it probably is. I'm very animated, so I move around a lot, and my mic doesn't move with me. Is everyone back from the intermission? Great. Now, this sequence has some of my favorite shots in the film in terms of composition, and I think it's just one of my favorite parts of the film in general. I love the design and the pared down color palette of what I call the nest because it feels natural, in stark contrast to every other location up to this point that's been very saturated, fantastic, and ornate. The sound design is wonderful as well. There's no music, and it's stripped down to faint echoes of movement and voices, making the nest feel vast and winding, and giving this sense that Mal is surrounded by something calling to her that she can't quite make out. So she follows the wind and the voices, and to her amazement, she sees a room full of creatures like her, which we later find out are dark fae. The main fae are Bora, whom we know killed the poachers because we saw his face, and Connell, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, who saved Mal. I think the fact that one was introduced while taking a life and the other while saving it already establishes their dynamic. Bora is clearly okay with violence, and Connell probably isn't, so it's likely going to cause a rift between them. So the scene starts with Bora holding what I assume is the iron pellet they removed from Mal's side, which raised some questions I decided to answer with my own lore. The iron is definitely generating heat because we hear it sizzling, a word that should really only apply to bacon, so I don't know why I used it, and we see smoke. But the iron itself isn't glowing like we've seen it do whenever Mal gets close. Bora also doesn't seem fazed by it, compared to Mal, who can't even touch it for a second without flinching away in pain. So in my headcanon, Bora isn't hurt as much by the iron because he comes from a line of dark fae with extra resilient skin. That's why his face is craggy like stone, and the iron isn't glowing because that's a unique reaction to Mal's power. I have no idea what Connell is doing in this shot, by the way. It looks like he's swiping at nothing. Anyway, we know from the first film that humans and fairies have been at war off and on for ages. Connell says they're safe in the nest, killing humans only makes it worse, and they can't win a war against them anyway because of their numbers. But Bora says they won't be safe in the nest forever, so they have to go to war, and they can win with Mal because she has powers the rest of them don't. He then gets all up in that fairy face to piss her off so she'll demonstrate, and after seeing her power for themselves, everyone is excited. Now, I'm pretty lenient with my critiques of a film's logic because I'm fine with inconsistencies. I can easily explain myself in a way that fits within the scope of what's presented. What I found lacking here was a clear explanation of how Bora knew about Mal's powers in the first place. If they've been in hiding all this time, what drew them out? And what prompted Bora to start killing humans in the moors? It's not like it's close to the nest, it's across the ocean. Does he just hang out there sometimes? Then why haven't we seen him before? I think the simplest way to fill in that gap is with the legend. They already established that the story of what happened with Stefan's kingdom solidified the humans' fear of Mal. Why not establish, too, that the same story instilled hope in the Dark Fae? When Bora said that they can win with Mal, he could have tossed in a few lines about how he heard the tales of how she single-handedly destroyed human armies and brought an entire kingdom to its knees. That he risked going to the moors to see her power for himself, and the more he watched her from the shadows, the more he realized the legend was true, and that she was their only hope to save their kind. It would explain how he knew about her power and add depth to his character, because I could then assume he just happened to be in the moors the night the poachers came, and that given the trauma of living in fear of being slaughtered by humans, seeing them stealing fairies made him snap. So he killed them out of blind rage, not because he's just so violent that he went looking for a fight. It would also explain why Connell was around to save Mal. Maybe he started following Bora to the moors to keep an eye on him and to learn more about Mal himself, so it was just a coincidence that he was in the area when Mal was shot. I'm not saying my version is perfect or even that it's better, just that a few lines of dialogue is all it could have taken to clear up that plot thread, and it would still line up with everything that happens next. Connell gives Mal a tour of the nest, and it reminds me of Journey to the Center of the Earth because there's an entire world underground with different biomes suitable to the different types of dark fae. I liked seeing the snow and the desert and the woods, and yes, it was cheesy that everyone stopped what they were doing to look at Mal and Connell so we could get a look at them, but it works. This was the first time I thought they looked silly flying, though, because they weren't dipping and turning, and the close-up on this Rihanna-Zoe Saldana hybrid was even more awkward. I know it was to set her face apart so we'd recognize her in the climax, but her arms were so stiff. Anyway, Connell explains that this is their nest of origin, and he goes full, "Think of the children," saying they should be out there flying over the rivers and trees, not in exile. Mal says she'll protect them from the humans, and Connell rightly points out that she can't fight them all, so maybe they can coexist in peace like she does with Aurora, which clearly strikes a nerve, so Mal says it's never going to happen. Speaking of Aurora, which, God, I'm just so tired of saying, it makes me sound like a dog trying to learn how to speak. Aurora. Aurora. But this is where her inner conflict begins. Pfeiffer tries to manipulate her, pretending she's sympathetic to Mal's feelings, despite the fact that she was just screaming for her head and calling her a threat to everyone. She mentions the fact that Mal's horns were covered as if she were meek and cowering, a callback that makes Aurora feel even more at fault for Mal's aggression. Meanwhile, Bitch announces Philip and Aurora's wedding in 3 days, and that everyone from the Moors is expected to come, which is a bold ask considering how big the Moors is. But for the sake of this part of the story, we'll pretend it's teeny tiny. And this is another example of what I said earlier about hating Gerda's characterization. Look at her face. Listen to the disgust in her voice.
And all are expected.
Her intensity here would have made sense if they gave us even a grain of insight into why she harbors this much hatred for the Moors. Instead, she comes across as a stone-faced, mildly unhinged queen sycophant with a stick up her ass for no reason, and no one points that out despite her being ever present. Not a single shot of a servant saying, "No, I don't trust that one," while giving her the side eye. And I know I keep complaining about her, but my god, I'm glad they named her Gerda because she gives me agita. Percival's character is miles better because they explained his stance. He thinks the Moors are a threat to the kingdom because he heard the stories about Mal's destruction, so he does his job as general to protect it. What the fuck is Gerda doing? Jumping back to Mal, Connell tells her the Dark Fae evolved from the Phoenix and she's its last direct descendant. That's why her powers are unique. And in case you've never heard of a phoenix or seen Harry Potter, it's a mythical bird best known for being reborn from its ashes when it dies. So who do you think is going to die at some point and come back to life? Me, if this video gets a lot of likes and a lot of views and a lot of watch time. But Connell gives Mal a moving speech about transformation, and that despite all the chaos and division between the fairies and the humans, she found love in a hopeless place. So he asks Mal to help the rest of the Fae broker peace with the humans too, again bringing up the fact that she loved her daughter Aurora enough to name her Queen of the Moors, which it turns out is the Dark Fae's last natural habitat. But Mal says she has no daughter because Aurora chose her side. Then Bora tells Connell the wedding is in 3 days, so that's when they're going to strike and kill all the humans and blah 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 blah. Back at the castle, Aurora is feeling conflicted about her new life. She wants to wear the dress the fairies made for the wedding, but she feels pressured to wear Pfeiffer's dress instead, and she gets painted up for a stuffy aristocratic brunch that makes her feel out of place. When Philip catches her later on peering out at the Moors, she tells him she feels like a different person. Like the loving man he is, he reassures her that he doesn't want her to change. And I was annoyed that she didn't say, "But your mother does," since that's where the pressure is coming from, because his response would have established which side of that dynamic he fell on. And I wanted to see that because up to this point, Philip has been completely detached from the relationship between Pfeiffer and Aurora, which weakens his reaction in the climax. We'll get to that. Now Pfeiffer's checking in on Lickspittle's progress, and he says the extraction process is painstaking, which is true if you consider shaking a plant's pollen onto a dish difficult, but I won't harp on that again, I promise. It turns out that when you add the tomb bloom's pollen to iron powder, or powder which is similar to whatever I just said, only correct, it creates a red dust that kills fairies. Or it turns them into what they were? Because when Lickspittle dumps it on a fairy that looks like a dandelion, it turns into a dandelion. Does that mean that every fairy that looks like something from nature is actually that thing brought to life by magic? If so, who gave them life? The Dark Fae evolved from the Phoenix. Surely they can't be the only fairies that exist in the world naturally. And what will the powder turn them into? I was so curious. Also, that porcupine fairy is 100% saying, "What the fuck? What the fuck?" after seeing that other fairy die. Anyway, it cuts to a scene of the Dark Fae rocking out around a fire. You know, the obligatory calm before the storm. And we're shown this Asian fairy for the second time. The first time he was teaching the children to fly. I mention that because like Rihanna Saldana, it's obvious the film is showing a specific Fae, so we'll recognize them during the battle. And they don't really speak, so I didn't know their names, I just remember their faces. Now that I can look them up though, the Asian Fae dude's name is Udo, Rihanna Saldana's name is spelled like Shrike, but that's dumb, so I'll say Shriek, and the Asian Fae woman's name is Ini. They showed a close-up of her too, I just forgot. So they're partying, and at the same time, Percival and Gerda are leading soldiers into the moors to get more tomb bloom. Mal senses this and flies home, with Connell and Bora close behind. But when she gets there, the graveyard's already destroyed. Then the soldiers ambush them, shooting at Mal. Connell protects her by taking the hits himself, and she puts up a barrier to keep them safe, while Bora tears the soldiers a new one. How Percival and Gerda made it out of there alive, I don't know. I'll just assume they snuck away while their men were being massacred. Regardless, once the deed is done, Mal and Bora fly the now fatally wounded Connell back to the nest. Skipping ahead to the wedding day, the moorfolk arrive at the castle, and the guards usher them into the chapel. Diaval, who is still trapped in human form, tries to go with them, but mistaking him for human, the guards stop him, stating their orders were to seat the moorfolk first. Finding that suspicious, Diaval sneaks off to investigate, and this is where the movie becomes infuriating. Aurora is dressing for the ceremony when Philip knocks on her door and hands her a tomb bloom as a pre-wedding gift. As expected, Aurora asks where he got it, and Philip says his mother. Aurora's response should have been that the tomb bloom grows from a fairy's grave, so why the fuck does the queen have one? Instead, she just stands there. Only after he's gone does she eye the tomb bloom with suspicion. To me, that exchange was the filmmakers yet again letting Philip avoid weighing in on the relationship between his soon-to-be wife and his mother, letting him continue traipsing around off screen until he's needed to progress the plot. But it gets worse. Aurora sneaks out of her room to do some digging and heads into Pfeiffer's wardrobe. I'll allow the contrivance of her going there without any hint as to why, and I'll allow her eyeing the dress forms as if she'd have any reason to think something was up with them. I even allowed a head on a dress form controlling a gear and pulley system in a wall that it's not in any way attached to, so you can't say I'm not merciful. What I won't allow is the fact that the head is already turned when Aurora enters the room. The way the mechanism works was pretty clear when Pfeiffer used it. The door is shut when the head is straight, and turning the head triggers it to open. Once it's fully open, the mechanism releases, the door closes, and the head returns to its forward-facing position. Explain to me then why the head is turned when Aurora walks in. Here's my easy fix. Aurora sneaks out to do some digging, and as she passes the wardrobe, she notices a gap beneath the wall. She goes in for a closer look, realizing there's a passage behind it, which prompts her to check the room for a way to open it fully. That's when she notices the head on the dress form is turned, and it's the only one, so she straightens it, which closes the gap the rest of the way, teaching her that turning it must be how you open it. My version wouldn't have taken any longer. It would have explained why the head was already turned, because the mechanism got stuck, which is why the entrance wasn't fully closed. And as a bonus, it would have implied that Pfeiffer entered the passage shortly before Aurora arrived, adding tension. Will she catch Pfeiffer red-handed? Stay tuned to find out. But no, we got this instead. And it's fine, because it gets worse. Aurora's fingy starts to feel weird, and that prick must have been pretty hard for her to still have a hole in it 5 years later. Mine's out of the gutter, please. So, drawn by magic that shouldn't exist anymore, she finds her way to the spinning wheel in Lickspittle's lab, and she reaches for the spindle, but before she touches it, she has a fucking vision of Pfeiffer stabbing the king with it. Sure. It's then that she notices the missing fairies in jars, none of which seem to be suspended in liquid, just saying, and Aurora grabs Lickspittle in anger, asking, "What has he done?" But his shirt tears, revealing scars where wings should be. Surprised, Aurora says, "You're a pixie," and Lickspittle is offended. "How dare you call me that? I'm Lickspittle the nobleman, and I serve the queen." To which Aurora responds, "She took your wings." Then Lickspittle looks at his back as if he's confused. I'm sorry, was he under the impression that he's human? Did he convince himself that they considered him a nobleman despite the fact that nobility wouldn't work as a servant? Did he repress his fairy identity so much that he forgot he had wings? I guess none of those questions matter because Pfeiffer walks in, Lickspittle runs out, and we never hear about any of it again. But don't worry, we will have some questions answered because cue the woe is me monologue where Pfeiffer explains her motivations. When she was a child, her kingdom had a harsh winter where the crops failed and the people fell into famine. She and her brother said they should forcefully take what they needed to survive from the moors, since the fairies were thriving. But their father, the king, wanted peace and said they should ask the fairies instead. Like a nerd. So he sent Pfeiffer's brother to the moors to seek their kindness, and according to her, the moorfolk killed him. Upset by that, the people overthrew Pfeiffer's father, she was cast out, and forced to marry the king of Ulstead, whom she sees as weak like her father because he also wants peace. So she believes peace will be their downfall again, and she refuses to let that happen. Now, So, if Pfeiffer's only goal was to get rid of the king because she feared that one day a situation would arise where peace wasn't an option and he'd be too weak to do what needed to be done, I'd be fine with that explanation. But she also started a war with the fairies, which aligns more with the motivation she hinted at earlier in the film, where she said she wants to kill all of the fairies and take the Moors for herself. So for the sake of consistency, I think she should have mentioned that part to Aurora too, that she'll never let peace be their downfall, and she'll never be deprived by the fairies again because the Moors will be hers. Anyway, the guards come rushing in, suggesting Lickspittle went to warn them, and Pfeiffer has Aurora locked in her room. Meanwhile, back at the nest, it's time to go to war, and Bora gives his people a pet talk. Shriek and Eney even have dialogue this time. We will ride together! We fight together! And off the Dark Fae go to attack Ulstead. Now, Pfeiffer's plan starts to unfurl. The guards barricade the door of the chapel so the Moor folk can't get out, and Gerda starts playing the organ, which is rigged to dispense the red dust. Is it absurd and overly dramatic? Oh yes, very much yes. Do I hate the way Gerda emotes while she plays? Oh my god, double yes. But it makes for a visually interesting scene with relatively high stakes, and it's kind of like Disney's answer to the Red Wedding from the Game of Thrones, so I'm into it. Cut to the balcony, Aurora sees the chaos happening below and knows she needs to get out of the room, so she uses fabric tied to her bed to escape. Clever girl. Except somehow she weighs enough for this huge bed with a solid decorative wooden frame to go zipping across the room fast enough that when it hits the railing, she gets flung at full speed through the glass doors of the room below where Philip is watching over his father. I thought it was fun, especially because she hit the glass pretty hard, I'm not sadistic, and extra points for her rolling on the floor up into a standing position and into Philip's arms. Very smooth. Philip says, "What's going on?" And it cuts to the Dark Fae arriving. Now comes the editing choice I hated so much that it's literally what compelled me to do this review. You would think that Aurora's scene ending with Philip asking her what's going on means that when we eventually cut back to them, he'll be filled in and acting upon that information. No. First, we cut back to them still holding each other, suggesting that maybe Aurora didn't have a chance to answer him yet. Then we see them run to the balcony and gawk at what's going on for a while until Aurora says, "They look just like her." Then we see Philip say Mal started a war, first his father, now this, which is when Aurora finally explains that Mal didn't curse the king, his mother did it with a spindle. And Philip looks about as confused as he should, considering Aurora didn't say shit to him about his mom the entire film. Nor, apparently, about the fact that the reason she came crashing through glass a minute ago was because his mother had her locked in the fucking room. Listen, I understand that when action ramps up, filmmakers start cross-cutting like crazy, but can we address what just happened first, then let that lead into what's happening around it? And it annoyed me so much, I didn't even care about the sketchy continuity. Like, where's the makeshift rope she rode in on? And where's the glass on the floor? I don't hear it crunching under their feet, and kudos to Aurora for not minding it since she's barefoot. Or the fact that we see Bora use his power to make roots crawl up the castle walls, yet when we see the walls a minute later, the roots are gone. Then they're back again. So the Dark Fae are getting absolutely menaced by the red dust, which kind of answered the question I had earlier. When it hits them, they turn into stuff. I just can't tell what kind of stuff. Sometimes it looks like leaves, sometimes it looks like snow, other times it looks like other things, so I guess it depends on which kind of Dark Fae they are. Meanwhile, Aurora shows Philip the puncture wound in the king's arm, so he believes her about his mum and the curse still being in the spindle, even though it shouldn't be, but the movie's almost over, so I'm just accepting it with grace at this point. Even though the Dark Fae have arrived, Mal is still back at the nest looking over Connell. And when he dies, she touches their foreheads together, and it looks like she absorbs some of his energy, or maybe it's their ancestral energy, and the fossil is whispering, and I don't know what that's about, but her eyes change color, so move over, Sophie Turner. The real Dark Phoenix is here. Now we get to see the B-Team shine. Believe it. Shriek tells her Rainbow Pride Jungle Fae to flank as she heads into the castle to bowl over some guards, while Eney gets trapped on the wall and starts some sweet horn-to-hand combat. Aurora is putting her callous woodland feet to work as she rushes to the chapel to save the moorfolk, and Diaval meets up with her, but they can't get the barricade down. A tree guard gets got saving the godmothers, Gerda is having an orgasm, it's madness and I love it. Then Shriek gets taken down by a net and utterly explodes a wooden post. Just decimates it and its whole family. But it's Udo's turn, so he flies in and saves some kids from falling debris, because the film established that tending to the children is kinda his thing. Which brings us to the final confrontations. Philip comes stomping along demanding that Pfeiffer stop the massacre, and she says, but they've got cool stuff in the moors and I want it. Then he says they should all work together, but she says peace sucks, so she's protecting them from it, and Percival looks back and forth between them like, I don't know what to do. Then Philip asks Pfeiffer if she was protecting the king too. And instead of clarifying that statement, he just stands there. So Pfeiffer says, guards, I think the prince needs to go to his room now. Away with him, go. So the guards approach him, but he evades them by jumping off the tower, followed by Percival. Remember how I said at the start of the film that they'd be having a row at the end? Right. Now they're wrestling on the ground, and Philip tells Percival the queen cursed the king. But before Percival can process that information, Bora swoops in and straight up knocks his door. Back at the chapel, in a scene I really did like, one of the godmothers sacrifices herself to save the others by stuffing it up the pipes, and the guards subdue Aurora and Dieval. And I knew something was going to happen here because the guards dogpile Dieval for no reason. And call me a simp for schlock, but I loved this entire sequence. We see a color flickering in the sky, so we know Mal is on her way, and sure enough, Dieval transforms into a bear! A sweet callback to when Dieval asks Mal if she'd ever consider turning him into one because he thought he'd make a good one. So she breaks through the clouds and starts wrecking the army's balls, as you do, and it cuts back to the chapel again where Gerda is trying to unclog the organ. Enacting their pint-sized revenge, Knotgrass and Thistlewit try to stop her, and I may be a pacifist, but I wanted them to slap Gerda around, not just flutter about in her face. Like, I wanted to see contact. I wanted to hear this. But, you know, at whatever volume I guess would make sense for fairies, so maybe that. Then I wanted them to grab her by the hair and yank her ass over the balcony. Alas, in true Disney fashion, they just caused her to lose her balance and she fell on her own. Boo. Then Dieval helps the Moorfolk escape. So Philip is having a lovely nap, and Percival thinks Bora is going to attack him, so he shoots Bora with a crossbow. But you know Bora has that extra tough skin because that's what I decided. So he gets up, walks over to Percival like it's nothing, and he's about to knock the black off him when Philip puts a sword to Bora's neck and tells him to stand down. Remember how I said the sword he was told he'd never have to use at the start of the film would come back at the end? Right. So Philip tells Bora this is all Pfeiffer's doing, he just wants peace, and he throws the sword down. Mal sees this from a distance and is moved by it, and Bora is so moved he takes off screaming because he just can't handle the unity. Time for the queen! In an ideal world, Mal would have slapped Pfeiffer off the tower and that would have been that. But we were just shown that peace might be the answer after all. So Mal takes a second to have a mommy-daughter moment instead, giving Pfeiffer the chance to shoot a red dust arrow. Of course, Mal shields Aurora and gets shot herself, turning into ash. So maybe peace isn't always the answer after all. Anyway, Pfeiffer yaps about how she was the one who spread the stars about the magician, blah, 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 who cares? And then Aurora's tears trigger Mal's rebirth into the Phoenix. And that, friends, is why I didn't mind that she didn't turn into a dragon in the first film. Unfortunately, dumb things happen, like she doesn't immediately bite Pfeiffer's head off. Instead, she again has a mommy moment for some reason, giving Pfeiffer room to toss Aurora off the tower so she can escape. But there's zero tension there, because we all know Mal is going to save Aurora, so she does. Then she's like, caw, I bless the wedding, caw, I'm a phoenix, and everyone is happy. Then Kiss-Ass comes over with the spindle and says to Mal, I think this belongs to you. No, it doesn't. That spindle doesn't belong to anyone because it doesn't exist. It's a plot hole. And would you believe they tried to fill it after the fact by having him say, curses don't end, they're broken. Oh, you mean like they did in the first film, you idiot? Don't think I forgive you just because you set Shroomsy free. But whatever, Mal shatters a spindle and that ends the curse. Until there's a Maleficent 3 and they're like, curses don't break, they melt. So now they have to bring the spindle to Mount Doom. Anger aside, the rest of the film is Closure City. The king wakes up, they have the wedding, Percival and Shriek make googly eyes at one another, a winkety wink, fuck off lick shit, and all's well that ends well. Sort of. One thing I gave major points to the first film for doing is actually killing the villain. It was still a Disney cop-out because Stefan fell to his death, but at least he died. Here, there's a scene where Pfeiffer thinks she's getting away, but she gets cornered by Bora and some of the other Fae. All they had to do was cut away from that and quietly show her crown rolling out of the room or something, suggesting she's dead. Instead, Mal turns her into a goat. At least the king has sense. When Philip tells him Mal can turn Pfeiffer back, he's like, or we can leave her that way? Are you fucking serious right now? I hate that Pfeiffer's comeuppance was played for laughs. She tried to murder the king, and Aurora, and Mal more than once, probably would have tried to kill Philip too if it came to it, and she did murder who knows how many fairies between the ones they experimented on and the ones they blasted with red dust during the fight. She deserved to die more than Stefan, but fine. The film ends with a quaint scene of Mal visiting the newlyweds with a bright smile on her face, and she's doing this cute little sway thing back and forth that's just adorable, and I love it, and I love Angelina. But the writers dropped the ball here too. Aurora says,
"Will you stay a while? A little while. But don't worry. I'll see you at the christening."
Not gonna lie, that's a dark joke, having a laugh about the time she practically condemned Aurora to death as a baby. Nice choice. I just didn't like the lead-in. She said she is staying a little while, but don't worry, she'll see them at the christening. She should have said she's not staying. And so we end my detailed review of Maleficent, Mistress of Evil on me nitpicking a throwaway line of dialogue, which is very me. Now, I don't like rating things with numbers or stars, so I'll say that despite my complaints, I really enjoyed this film. Jolie's performance was again impeccable. Everyone else was great too. Neither film wants for talent, I can say that much. I was fine with the pacing and never felt like it was dragging despite the 2-hour runtime. I deeply appreciate that they didn't set Connell up as a love interest because it would have felt undercooked, and they did a lot of other things right visually and tonally. But I think I liked Maleficent better. It was a tighter story that didn't have as many opportunities to go off the rails as this film did, and while both were character-driven to an extent, they didn't do that great of a job in this film in fleshing out the secondary players. They could have spent more time at the nest with Mal learning about the different tribes, giving us a reason to care about the other Fae beyond us having seen their face that one time. The spindle being brought back as a catalyst for the conflict also put me off, mainly because there were so many other directions they could have gone in, like introducing new magic. Overall, I think it's a flawed film that's still good enough to recommend watching. Now I want to know what you think. And even though I couldn't care less about film scores to a degree, I know other people do, so for your benefit, I'll cite them. The first Maleficent sits at 54% on Rotten Tomatoes with an audience score of 70, while Mistress of Evil is at 39% with an audience score of 95. So critical opinion went down, but audience opinion went up. I genuinely think 39% is harsh, so I'm glad the amount of positive feedback from audiences is high because again, it's a good movie that I think you'll enjoy. I just like the first one better. One thing I'll never understand is people who complain about a remake for being a remake, meaning they hate the film, or at least penalize it, because the filmmakers changed things rather than because they don't like the changes they made. Meanwhile, the same people often complain about remakes that changed nothing, asking why the filmmakers bothered if they weren't going to take the story in a new direction. If a remake deviating from the original is in itself a deal breaker for you, at least acknowledge that it's not the movie's fault. That's just you. Otherwise, it's like watching a horror film, knowing that you hate horror, then saying the film sucked because it was scary. That's not a fair assessment. Maleficent is a new take on an old tale. You don't have to love it, but it's silly to hate it just for not being the same. Anyway, I guess I'll wrap this up by saying that my goal here is to share my passion for storytelling and encourage you to dive into all of the amazing and not so amazing content streaming near you. So if you want to watch any of the films I covered here, which you should, I'll link to them in the description. Both Sleeping Beauty and Mistress of Evil are available right now on DisneyPlus. Maleficent might be, depending on your region. I'm in the States and we don't have it, but you can rent it on YouTube. Also, since this is my first upload, I suppose I should let you know what to expect going forward. The important thing is that nothing here will be spoiler-free. I just don't have the patience to tiptoe around what I want to say. So if I post a video about a show or film you want to go into blind, I recommend watching it first, then checking out my video. As for the type of content I'll be posting, expect a mix of long-form, overly detailed breakdown reviews like this one, far less detailed reviews where I sum up my thoughts in about 20 minutes, some off-the-cuff real-time reactions, the occasional video essay, and fun bite-sized content to spice things up. I also watch a lot of foreign films and episodic fare, so if you don't mind subtitles, or you speak other languages besides English, you can look forward to that. And finally, I know this is a strange thing to bring up out of nowhere, but I also know it's a problem across social media, so I might as well address it now, even though odds are, if this ever does become an issue, no one will care that I said this. I don't read or watch other people's reviews before compiling my own thoughts. I barely watch review channels in general, and it's important to me to do things my way without external influence. So if anything in my video ever resembles someone else's, whether it's something I say, a topic I choose, or my visual style, or I guess my speaking style, which some people tell me sounds like I'm a radio host, this voice is not on purpose. And I know it fluctuates, and I know my accent fluctuates. None of that is on purpose, it's just how I emote. I will likely sound different in every video I post, and we'll all just have to deal with it. But like I said, no matter what it is, if something I do seems like something someone else has done, just accept that I didn't copy them and save me the trouble of having to say it. I probably won't even know who you're talking about, and if I ever need to refer to another source or use someone else's content, I'll say that in the video. I also have zero interest in drama, so don't expect to see any commentary on my channel about other channels. Life is too short, and I'm not that tall. P.S. My name is Lady. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm a writer, among other things, and I look forward to rambling about my humble opinions, so thanks for being here to listen. It really is a stream come true.